with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show. Everybody, welcome to the Phronesis podcast. Today, I have Dr. Jill Arensdorf, and she is a professor in the Department of Leadership Studies at Fort Hays State University and currently serves as the Fort Hays State University Provost and Vice-President for Academic Affairs. Prior to serving as provost, she chaired the Department of Leadership Studies for 8 years. Her research interests include civic engagement and leadership behavior and skill development, and the transfer of learning. She's published numerous articles on the effects of service learning and the development of leadership skills, as well as the transfer of leadership skills in the workplace. She has been active in civic engagement efforts at Fort Hays State University, co-writing their civic investment plan and co-coordinated a freshman learning community at Fort Hays. Dr. Arensdorf has received both the prestigious Navigator and Pilot Awards at FHSU for her exceptional advising and teaching. She completed her Ph.D. in curriculum and instruction at K-State in Manhattan. I love Manhattan. It's a great place. Dr. Arensdorf is extremely passionate about teaching about and participating in leadership. Prior to her work at Fort Hays State University, she worked as a 4-H youth extension agent with K-State Research and Extension. Jill is originally from Hill City, Kansas. She and her husband, Mike, currently reside in Hays, Kansas. Her interests include spending time with her family, music, golfing, reading, cooking, and water skiing. Jill, I'm so excited for this conversation. This is going to be a lot of fun. I didn't realize you were 8 years as department chair before you moved into provost.
I was. It's good to see you, Scott, and good to visit with you. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of your podcast.
Yes. Well, okay. So what else do listeners need to know about you? Is there anything that wasn't on your official bio that we should know?
Oh, gosh. I think one thing that I did leave out that's really important to me is we have a 15-and-a-half-year-old black lab at home that is thriving through this summer heat. And that's an important part of my life that is not in my bio, but very important to me.
What is the black lab's name?
Her name is Maggie.
Maggie, 15 and a half years.
Yeah, she's 15 and a half years. She's had a good life and probably won't, be with us much longer, but she's lived a good, happy life.
Oh, that's awesome. Awesome. When we saw each other a few weeks ago we were in Kansas City.
We were.
And we were talking at lunch a little bit, and we were talking a little bit about your role as provost. And I thought, wow, we need to have a conversation because I really am super interested in understanding this, as someone who taught leadership for so long and the leadership theory and just immersed in all of that work. And then you're serving as provost, which is an incredibly complex role. It's not an easy role, especially at this time in the history of higher education. There's just a lot of complexity. And I was thinking to myself, wow, we need to have a conversation, and I would love to get some of her reflections on that transition. Like what holds from our theory? what holds up? What doesn't hold up? And just some general themes. And so I'm hoping we can kind of move into that direction today.
Scott, I've been looking forward to this conversation ever since you reached out. And I've been thinking a lot about this. In fact, at the conference that you mentioned that we saw each other at, I did a roundtable discussion to talk a little bit about this with our colleagues to discuss what my experience has been like, but also hear from other colleagues in leadership education that hold leadership roles on their campuses and in their respective communities. And we had a nice, robust conversation with, I think, more to come on this topic, because it's important. And it's important for us as leadership educators to be thinking about not only how we serve our students in the classroom and how we teach leadership, but how do we do the things that we're teaching in not only higher education, but outside of that. And boy, I tell you what, you know this, but leadership is so hard. And newsflash, right? Newsflash, leadership is hard. And it's difficult and it's messy and it's challenging, but it's so rewarding. And so I hope today we can unpack some of the things that I've experimented with and tried in this role and found to be really challenging, but also really rewarding in the role as provost here at Fort Hays. And I'm sure that many folks that are listening to this will be able to relate to some of these experiences, even if they haven't served in a specific role as provost or vice president at a university.
Great. Okay, so let's start with what surprised you about stepping into the role? What were some things that surprised you?
So I had served, as you mentioned in my bio, I'd served as department chair at this university for a number of years prior to stepping into the provost role. And so I understood the university, so I thought.
Yeah.
What surprised me is how different the university looks and feels in a different role. And it's the same people, it's the same value system, it's the same, fabric that's interwoven and connected. But in a different role, you have a different vantage point. And I knew that would happen, but I didn't understand how challenging that would be to wrap my head around and really get to a 30 or 40,000 foot view of the university and step into a role where I had to lead differently. Some of the principles that I use to lead are still the same, but they have to be deployed very differently because the team that I lead is different. The scope of work is different, and the level of complexity is different in this role. And those were very surprising, challenging changes for me, and things I'm in my fourth year in this role. I would call it struggling with most days to just find that balance of what does leadership look like in this role.
As you were just telling that story, because I think it was just beautifully said. I don't know if you've ever seen that book Zoom, where you can look at something at the ground level and then you look at something 10 feet up and then 20 feet up and then 30 feet up, and it just zooms out. And I think I had that image in my head. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but I just thought of that as an image. So you kind of zoom up to 40,000 feet, and how you lead shifts, how you have to view the institution shifts, what has to be a priority and not a priority shifts. I have to imagine that's a huge adjustment.
Yeah. And my default was, I like to be involved in things. I'm a doer. And one of my strengths is in Strengths Quest is I'm an achiever. And so I have found that to be really challenging for me in this role, because I am not necessarily always the doer in this role. I can't be and shouldn't be. And that's not the best use of my time, even though that's my default. And so I've really had to challenge myself to see the forest and not get mired in the trees where I'm maybe more comfortable in the details, so that I can check them off and say, hey, we're accomplishing this today. And so that's been a good challenge for me, but one that I've really had to stretch myself on.
Well, and I love the framing of that, a good challenge for me. I mean, It's not my default. It's not my natural place. And I imagine just how you define achievement is so much different than maybe how you defined achievement, even as a chair, right?
Yeah.
What does achievement look like now?
You know what? Some days, Scott, achievement is I've made it through all the meetings, and
Yes.
that's the achievement of the day. Or I answered a few emails today. And then some days it's, hey, we made progress on a really big challenge here, a really daunting challenge that we have at Fort Hays. Difficult challenge is we are revising our general education program. And just today in a meeting that I was in, we made some really good progress with the team that I oversee on some of those changes. And so I'm going to call that achievement for the day. Even though it's the day's not ended, I feel like we collectively achieved something. But sometimes achievement is just simply, I made it through the day. We made it through the day collectively, and we made it to all the meetings, and we got through those, and we keep progressing forward. I like knowing a lot about, I like digging into things, and sometimes it's just not possible to do that because there's just so many things. And so that's something that achiever in me, I've had to really work on.
What else has surprised you?
So Scott, I'm sure in the classes that you teach, you emphasize how important communication is. I always did. And in whatever leadership class I was teaching, communication was always a focus. Wow, is it difficult? And I know that, but the amount of information and thinking through who needs to know what in what order and what channels we should be using, what needs to come directly from me versus through the chain of command, what needs to be prioritized in the different venues that I or my team might be leading in or communicating in, that has been really difficult. And just when I think we're getting it right, I recognize that, whoops, we missed that one. It's been a challenge. That one has been more frustrating for me because I cannot figure out the best way to communicate out to the masses on things that are important to folks. We could send a mass email, right? That would be the default. But is that the best way to communicate? Is that the best way to articulate the importance of the priority or whatever it may be? And so that has been a constant challenge for me as well, as just trying different communication strategies and experimenting.
Yeah.
I know you had a podcast, I can't remember who it was, but that you talked about experimenting. And I have learned to live in the unfamiliar of experiments. and I'm not comfortable there all the time, but I have to recognize, you know what, we're going to try it this way. And if it doesn't work, we will collectively experiment in a different way. And we've had some wins with that, and we've had some losses with that. And I know with leadership, there's going to be wins and losses. The other piece that I think has been key is developing those relationships. Can't emphasize that enough when we're talking about doing leadership. I'm going to have the opportunity to teach this fall. I'm going to teach a class, and I cannot wait to talk about these kinds of things in a little different way than I did even 3 years ago, just because of my experiences, not because I'm better at it, not because I'm perfect in the role, but just I have had different experiences that have caused me to rethink and shape perhaps how I might share with students what leadership looks and feels like and should be like in a role.
Okay. I want to stay on communication real quick, because I mean, you added in some complexities there, which we rarely explore as leadership educators. We can talk about the importance of communication, but kind of it ends there. We don't necessarily get into who, when, how many times.
Yes.
Right. So what have you found that's worked? I mean, is it just a multi-front kind of endeavor? We're going to tweet this. We're going to put together a video. We're going to put together a meeting. It's going to be in an email. We're going to reinforce it multiple times. What's worked based on some of those experiments?
Yeah. So I don't know that I've figured out what's worked.
Yeah.
But I've learned that the situation matters and the context matters. That's my first, when I'm thinking about how to communicate a message, I go right to what's the situation, what's the context. We're on summer break right now, and faculty are not here for the most part, because most of our faculty are on 9-month contracts, not all, but most of them. So summer is not a great time, thinking about situation and context, summer's not a great time to be communicating out really important university level initiatives.
Yes.
I haven't made that mistake, but my gut is sometimes to think, well, I can go ahead and send this out while I have time. Well, that's not going to be best for the situation. Thinking about the people that need to really read and understand the message. So situation and context matters. I have found that I need to be clearer in my communication. Sometimes I feel like I communicate clearly. And then I've learned just this past spring, I had a few situations where I felt like I was communicating clearly through meetings and I wasn't. And I learned what we always learn the hard way, where people had misperceived some things and were making some assumptions that were just incorrect. And so having a forum where I could correct those. So that would be more of a large forum style communication. I'm not as comfortable in those, but I know those are important so that people can come together and ask questions and hear from me in real time. I think that's really important in my role. I've done videos. I've done Zoom coffees where folks get together on Zoom and have a beverage or food of their choice, and we just have conversations. I do use email, not maybe more than I want, because I know that that's not something that people, but when you need to communicate out to the masses, that's the best way to do it. But what I haven't figured out how to do, Scott, but I'd like to do more of is the smaller group, because I feel like that's where the rich learning can occur. And I'm getting ready, hopefully, to experiment a little bit with some of those this fall, and like thinking about bringing some groups of people together just to kind of have some conversation about what's next for Fort Hays State. How could you play a part in it? What's helped me diagnose the situation, help me think about what are the adaptive challenges, and just do some small conversations that way. I'm really looking forward to that, to see if people might respond. Regardless of what I do, I know people see me in an authority role. Yeah. And I have to be really thoughtful about that. Even though I want them to see me as just Jill, their colleague, I am in a different role. And I also have to keep that as part of the situation and context when I'm thinking about communication as well.
I want to go to some of that, but I want to go back to relationships real quick, because you're so good at building relationships with people. And I know that you genuinely value relationships with people. So even that, at this level, that has to shift. Even you just said, I hope I can get with some small groups of people. Like the one-on-one piece is probably that much less realistic at times to just do a one-on-one with large factions of the faculty or large factions of individuals at the institution. So it's so interesting, even how you develop relationships, because that's we talk about that as a glue, like in leadership. If you have the relationship that builds trust, and that's just a glue. And when you can't spend the time or don't have the time to build relationships in that same way, are there ways you've worked to develop relationships with different factions of the institution, even though it may not have been the way you would have in the past? Does that make sense, my question?
You bet it does. And I think it's been a little bit more, it does, absolutely. Yeah. I think for my situation, because I have worked at this institution for so long, the thing that's been challenging for me is a lot of those relationships were developed already. They're different now. And I recognize that, but I struggle with that because I was a department chair for many, many years and served with department chairs across the institution. And then all of a sudden I stepped into a role where when you look at the org chart, I'm above them, even though I don't feel like I'm above them, but I'm above them. And so I've had to really kind of re-navigate those relationships and unfortunately spend less one-on-one time because of time, but also because of navigating the fabric of the institution. And so I've chosen to do department type visits, unit type visits. The first year that I was in the role, I visited every department unit under academic affairs, which took an incredible amount of time, but it was really important for me to learn the institution from this vantage point. And to do that, I had to go to them. I feel like those relationships started to nurture that way. I also talked about, I host those monthly coffees that used to be in person, and now we're getting much better participation on Zoom. So we've hosted them. I've continued to host them on Zoom, even though many of the people are literally across the campus, but people participate more. And in those conversations, I've done some small group interaction where I've gotten to get to know folks at a different level by just asking questions like, what are you reading right now? Or what are you watching right now? Versus getting into the nitty gritty of what's going on at Fort Hays State. So those things have been experiments. Yes. I don't know that I can say that they're working, but I think that they have helped me learn the institution differently and show that those relationships are really important. I will meet with folks one-on-one if it's requested or if it's needed, but that's just not something that I could fit in my bandwidth to do, even though that would be ideal. It's just not possible.
Talk about some of the shifts in you being in that position of authority. Is there anything kind of in a general sense that you've noticed as you've moved from the department chair to provost? That shift in authority has to be, just felt. It just has to be felt on your part. What can you say about that?
It is felt. In fact, that is something that I wish I could just flip a switch and change, because I think I've struggled to accept them in this role. And I know that with the role comes lots of responsibility, and I accept that, but the shift in those relationships with people and how people view me in the role, because I'm in the role, has been a very hard pill for me to swallow, so to speak. So much so that I've been talking to people about it, because I've struggled to balance that, because it's felt like loss to me.
Yeah.
It's really felt like loss to me, because I am the same person. I have the same values. I have the same leadership philosophy, even though the way that I'm maybe doing leadership is differently than I was doing 4 years ago, because of the lessons that I've learned and the experiments that I've tried, and some have failed and some haven't. But people see me different because I park in a different place. I work in a different building. I have a different title. And I want so badly for people just to see me as Jill. And it doesn't happen that way in our organization. And I don't think in any organization, the title still matters. And I would love to change that.
Well, and again, something that I don't know we often give enough attention to as leadership educators. How do people transition? We talk about that on some level, but I think there's just a lot of dynamics there that it is hard to prepare someone for. I don't know that we always give enough attention to that. Does that make sense?
It does. I didn't when I was teaching full time.
Yeah, we just say, hey, the 4 I's: idealized influence, inspirational motivation. You'll be there. Go for it.
Yes. But when it comes to doing it, my goodness, it's full of all these complexities and nuances and critical thinking that how can you teach that? And so experimentation and giving students opportunities, but also as faculty, giving ourselves opportunities to practice the things that we're teaching, I think are so critical.
Yep.
We've got to, as leadership educators, educate, but we also have to continually develop ourselves and use the things that we're teaching our students. And I knew that. And I was in a leadership role as chair. We all serve in leadership roles, but I hadn't been thrust into one quite this big. And when the spotlight is more on you and it's more complex and there's more factions to work through, it adds a level of complexity that I know that I never prepared my students to handle. I don't know that I was doing a disservice to my students, but I think I'll be a better educator now and developer of people just because of my lived experiences, which we all are. When we have lived experiences, we have to use those in our work. I think we as leadership educators are pretty committed to that, but I hope people will remain committed to that and also think about ways to step into leadership roles in higher ed, because higher ed needs really good people leading institutions and departments and colleges and organizations. And so I hope more and more leadership educators, as the discipline has matured, will find themselves in these roles because we have the knowledge.
Well, let's talk about on the other end of the spectrum. We were kind of talking about what surprised you, or I forget the phrasing I used. What's totally held up for you when it comes to, okay, yeah, this is just primary to me being successful in this role? I love how you've kind of referred to Heifetz's work a number of times, like, look, I'm not going to put so much pressure on myself that this is going to be perfect. This is an experiment. We're going to try it. We're going to see if this works in this situation where we are right now. So it seems like that's something that for you is holding true. Like, hey, that way, this is an adaptive challenge. There's no clear-cut answer. Let's try and get the best understanding of what we're up against in the situation. And then let's try these 3 or 4 things with intentionality. And that's what we're going to, it's not going to be perfect, right? So I hear that in some of your answers. Are there other things that have kind of stood up for you as, wow, that's really helpful when I'm actually in this role right now, this way of thinking or this theory? Anything else come to mind?
Well, I've read a lot of Barb Kellerman's work, and she's done a lot of work recently on followers and situation and context.
Yes.
That is holding up for me. And I've already mentioned that situation and context a few times, and that does connect to Heifetz's work, but that has held very true to me, that a complex organization, situation and the context matters. And regardless of the size of the institution, higher ed is complicated.
Yes.
It's a complicated system, and I would say adaptive, and then the situational, that emphasis on situation and context has held up for me solidly. That doesn't mean I'm doing it perfectly.
No.
But those are 2 things that I'm constantly going back to as I evolve as a leader in my leadership role, and as I do leadership and hopefully engage others in the process as well. I'm not thinking of a specific theory, but the whole concept of engaging others still holds up well in this role. I recognize I am in a role with power and authority, but that influence still matters. And getting buy-in and listening to people, getting stakeholder involvement, that's so critical. Even if they're not the decision maker, still critical as a decision maker for me. And that has really held up.
Just the work of influencing and it sounds like even kind of co-creating with others, having them feel like they're a part of the process when possible. But then, yes, Barbara Kellerman's, leadership system, I think she calls it the leader, the followers, and the contexts. And are we looking at those 3? I loved in her book, Bad Leadership, where, she looked at one, group, maybe it was the section on Bill Clinton or the mayor of Washington, D.C., his name just escaped me, but she would look at the individual, the leader, and then the followers, who was around them, and then what was happening in the context that allowed Marion Barry, the former mayor of D.C., to kind of exist in that role after being convicted of drug offenses and so forth. And I think that framing is super helpful, because we tend to, at least in my opinion, lionize the individual, the great leader, when there's actually a lot more that's at play.
And I didn't mention that before, but what you bring up now, I have experimented a little with. I have to recognize that I'm still in a role where I can educate and develop other people. It's just different than being in the classroom, but I am working as I lead in this role to hopefully permeate the institution with more of these leadership concepts, so that we do have more emphasis on stakeholder involvement and buy-in from perhaps unusual voices. And
now you're going, was that Kansas Leadership Center or was that Heifetz?
I'm not sure which, I think that might be KLC actually. So engaging those voices that may not traditionally have an opportunity to be heard. And so that is difficult, but it's really important work, and still have not mastered that, but is really important as I think through process and change, that those are factors that I need to be really cognizant of, and that our systems here aren't necessarily set up for those voices to be heard.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
So being more intentional about that and asking difficult questions of who's not at the table that needs to be at the table, or who's in the boat, who's not in the boat that needs to be in the boat, or depending on what author,
on the bus.
Who's not on the bus, right? Yeah.
If we go to Collins.
Yeah.
Okay. So as we wind down our time, what's been a pleasant surprise in this role? What's something that you weren't expecting, but it's been like, oh, wow, this is pretty incredible. This is interesting.
Something that has really surprised me about this role is that I can do this.
Nice.
And when I was considering applying for the provost position, I had all of those thoughts that anyone would have when they're stepping into a different role. Can I do this? Am I equipped with the right skills? Will people be willing to work with me? Will they see me as a colleague and not an adversary? Some of those imposter syndrome things keep creeping in, but I have some days I've survived and some days I've thrived, and I'm really proud of that. And I don't think that that's because I'm special. I think it's because I am so fortunate to have spent a majority of my career learning about leadership. And that has equipped me to step into a role and use a lot of those things that I've been teaching to students. And while practicing those are so much more difficult than teaching and testing on them, it's so rewarding. And we all have that as leadership educators. And so I guess that's my call out to folks, is to say, we can do this. And we need more leadership educators stepping into roles of influence, not only in higher ed, but all over in organizations, because we have unique knowledge that can carry us forward.
Your answer reminded me of, we were at a dinner party, my wife and I, and she was serving as an executive director of a nonprofit at the time. And we were introducing ourselves, and she said something to the effect of, yeah, so I do leadership, and he just kind of talks about it. And I looked at her and I said, and how's that working out for you?
No, we do leadership. Teaching is doing. Yes, teaching is certainly doing. But that is funny. Good for her. I'd like to meet her someday.
Exactly. She's awesome. She's awesome. Well, Jill, as we wind our time down today, can you share with listeners maybe something you've been listening to or reading or streaming, or maybe something that's caught your eye recently? It doesn't have to have anything to do with what we've just discussed, but what's caught your attention?
So I am right now reading a book called Anna. One of the things that I didn't share in my bio is that I love fashion. I've always been really interested in fashion. Anna is a biography about Anna Wintour of Vogue. And so I'm reading about her because I've always been fascinated with her style of leadership. I am reading her biography right now, and I think it just came out a few months ago. So that's what I'm reading right now. I also just finished the book Quiet by Susan Cain. Yeah. It's a little bit older book.
Yes.
But as an introvert, I felt like that book was calling to me at this specific moment in my life. And so that's another one that I've wrapped up recently as well. So those are the two things that are on my nightstand, back porch when it's not so hot to read outside. So.
Oh, I love it. I love it. I have Quiet. I didn't read it, but I have it. It's one of those, when students walk in your office and say, have you read all of those? It's up there. But my answer is always a good portion of them. And then another portion, I got what I needed from it. And then some just no, right?
Yeah. And that's honest. The books on my shelves are the same way.
Yep. Jill, such a fun conversation. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I just really, really appreciate the work that you're doing. So much fun to get your perspective on your adventures based on kind of the history from which you enter into this role. And so thank you so much for your time, for sharing your wisdom. And I am going to be excited to hear next summer when we're together again, kind of how things are going. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott.
Have a great day.
You too.
I've not yet named the episode, but I think I'm going to call it A Good Challenge for Me. And the reason is, here's an individual who has stepped into that challenge, stepped into the space where she has spent many years, obviously leading in her institution as a department chair, obviously leading in her community, and now jumping in scope and taking on that challenge and really working to step up her knowledge, skills, and abilities in a way that many may not have stepped into. And so I just have great respect. I have great respect. I think after just even saying that, I am going to call it a good challenge for me. Because I think for each one of us, it's in those moments where we get that kind of feeling in our stomach, that little nervous tinge that I don't know how this is going to go. I think it's in that space where we know that we have an opportunity to grow. And as Jill said many times, it may not go well. It may not be perfect, but I'm going to do my best and I'm going to step into that. So Jill, thank you for the conversation. Thank you for the incredible work that you do. I hope to see you listeners at the International Leadership Association. I hope you'll be there. I'm going to be in Washington, D.C., and I can't wait. I can't wait to see many friends that I've made over the last couple of years that I've never met in person. I can't wait to see old friends. I can't wait to meet new friends. So you can find the link in the show notes. I hope to see you there. Everybody, have a wonderful, wonderful day wherever you are in the world, a wonderful night, a wonderful morning, and thanks for tuning in, as always. Be well. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.